Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'm going to be running through yesterday's Prime Minister's questions, a bit later than I normally do, between Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, with an Ian Blackford cameo at the end as well, but in a slightly unusual way, because the Prime Minister's made it clear that he has no idea how places put under his Tier 3 restrictions can ever come out of them. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the way these work, Keir Starmer for Labour gets to ask 6 questions. Ian Blackford of the SNP gets to ask 2. Other backbenchers get to ask questions as well. Boris Johnson then proceeds to answer his own made-up questions and sometimes even then doesn't get the correct answers. And I usually go over these in quite a bit of detail in the main meet, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently this time. Because at the end of the day, the Prime Minister is asked questions. If he doesn't answer them, I'm just going to say so. If he says something else worthy of note, which sometimes he does, like, for example, committing himself to a promise or telling a verifiable lie to Parliament, as he did yesterday, then I'll mention that too. But I don't see the point of repeating his usual pre-prepared blather because it's the same every week. And it makes no difference what the questions are about. It bears no link to the actual questions when the dangerous lunatic is sacrificing people's lives to feed his own ego. But before we get on to Starmer's questions, arguably the biggest scandal of the afternoon was a lie he told in trying to get out of a question from a backbencher before the proceedings really began proper. She was asking the Prime Minister not to expand the congestion charges for her part of London, you know, particularly in the current financial situation. Boris Johnson responded with a few things, but he particularly said that it was the current Mayor of London, Labour's Sadiq Khan, who had effectively bankrupted Transport for London before the virus even hit. Now, I could spend a whole video going through all the things that are wrong with this statement. I'm not going to. I'm not a Londoner. And I'm not quite sure how many people who watch this are. There'll be a reasonable number, I suppose. They will know more about it. But I will just say this, what is very obvious from some distance away from London. Boris Johnson was Mayor of London. Now, on Boris Johnson's last day as Mayor of London, Transport for London were operating a deficit of £1.5 billion. Under Sadiq Khan, that deficit has come down to £200 million as of the end of last year. In addition, Khan has had to run the books on a purely economical basis. Boris Johnson was allowed to pump public money into the system when he was messing it all up, and he still ran up a massive, massive deficit there. So all of his answer there was lies and showboating. But anyway, Starmer's first question. The first question was incredibly short. In fact, the first couple of questions, he was really just laying the ground to make the points later on. So the first question was, how does an area that goes into Tier 3 restrictions get out of those restrictions? That was it, sat back down again. To which then Johnson said, well, you need to get the R down to 1 or below. The R value, remember, just to be clear, it's the average number that if you are infected yourself, you will pass that infection on to. So if it's greater than 1, then the infection rate is going to increase because every person infected, on average, infects more than just one other person. If it's below 1, then on average, you're infecting fewer than one other person, so the infections will eventually come down. But of course, just to say that that's how you come out of Tier 3 is absolute crap, of course. Because, I mean, you can tell people, for example, to use face coverings. He might need to tell his own father to, for example. You can tell them to wash their hands regularly. You can tell them not to go into the office. You can tell them not to go to pubs. All these sorts of things you can tell people to do, and they understand it. Whether they do it is another matter. If they had more trust in the government, it might make them more likely. But you can tell people to do those. What you can't tell people to do is to get the R down. Because the point of this question is, how do I, living in a Tier 3 area, I'm not, but, you know, for millions who are, how do I help to get out of Tier 3? That's what the question is about. You can't tell me to get the R down. How do I get the R down? Even if I were infected, how do I get... What? No, what? The R value is not something you can adjust. It's a consequence of the way the infection spreads in a population according to the behaviour of that population. So anyway, Starmer then, for his second question, said, if an area in tier 3 did not get the R value below 1, because Boris Johnson has said, right, the way to get out of it is to get the R value at or below 1. So then Starmer said, okay, so let's say you're in a tier 3 area and you do not get the R value below 1. Are there any circumstances under which that area would come out of tier 3 if the R hadn't come below 1? Again, obvious little trap for later. To which Johnson said, well, look, the R value is one of the measures taken into account. There are others as well, such as rates of admissions to hospitals. Then Starmer said, okay, look, I'm a bit confused now, because if it's not the R value under 1, what is it? Because, what he's trying to say is, what do we tell people is their route out of tier 3? He said, look, millions of people want to know the answer to that. On Friday, the chief scientific officer said tier 3 on its own certainly isn't enough to get the R value below 1. On the same day, the Prime Minister himself said that there was only a chance of getting the infection rates down. And he said this goes to the heart of the issue in Greater Manchester and elsewhere. The widespread fear is that tier 3 is the worst of all worlds. It brings significant economic harm without getting the virus sufficiently under control to exit tier 3. So rather than a solution, tier 3 is a gateway to likely months of agony from which there is no likely exit. Can the Prime Minister not see the problem if there isn't a clear exit? So then Johnson said, well, look, I've said, areas in tier 3 will be reviewed after 28 days. Yeah, but if it's still bad, maybe even worse than when they went into tier 3, it will stay in tier 3, won't it, Johnson? And it will keep staying there, hence the months of agony, you idiot. And he also said, some of these areas in restrictions are already showing signs of progress. This is, of course, not true and, in fact, impossible because the new restrictions haven't been in place long enough to see that. The nature of COVID is one of the worst parts about it is the huge lag between cause and effect. But the bottom line is that in answer to Starmer's question, he doesn't obviously see it as a problem that nobody knows how to exit. Doesn't even see it as a problem that he doesn't know how to exit. Then Ford said, look, I appreciate that there will be a review after 28 days, but if the R value hasn't gone below 1 then the infection rate is still going up. Again, just to be clear, while ever the R is above 1, the infection rate carries on rising. Doesn't even level off. It levels off at 1. So he said if the R value hasn't gone below 1, infection rate's still going up. The numbers are still going up. Admissions are still going up. People in hospital are still going up. The deaths are still going up. He says, is the Prime Minister seriously saying that he would take an area out of tier 3 with the R above 1? I don't think so. Let me spell out what this means, he said. On Friday, thousands of people in Greater Manchester, taxi drivers, pub and hospitality workers, people working in betting shops, self-employed freelancers, will either be out of work or face significant pay cuts. But their rent and mortgage won't be lower. Their food and heating bills won't be lower. And that could last for months. Why can't the Prime Minister and the Chancellor understand this? Again, he's bringing the Chancellor Rishi Sunak into this. I talked about him earlier. And this has been a clear strategy from Starmer recently because Rishi Sunak could well be the Prime Minister next year. So he's making sure he starts working on him, tying him in with Johnson's failure as well. He said to Johnson, stop bargaining with people's lives, stop dividing communities and provide support that's needed in Manchester. To which then Johnson, it wasn't really a question, so I'm not going to blame Johnson for playing politics on this one and going off on a rant. Of course he went off on a rant. But he did try again and do his usual thing about talking about the money he'd given Manchester. But in actual fact, it's money that's taken away because it's not enough. It's negative. I've said it before. Don't talk to me about money going into a system or into an area unless you're going to compare it to the money that's actually needed. So then Starmer stood up and he said, look, this is a Prime Minister who can pay £7,000 a day for consultants on track and trace, which isn't even working, that can find £43 million for a garden bridge that was never built, but he can't find £5 million for the people of Greater Manchester. Now, at this point, if I can give Starmer a little bit of a tip on presenting figures there, the £43 million for a garden bridge that was never built, yes, good. The £7,000 a day for consultants. Now, what that was the upper limit of what an individual consultant was paid on track and trace. And sure, track and trace has not worked. So you could argue any money spent on consultants has been a complete waste because actually the system has got worse. But why not do what Johnson does and make the figures bigger? Put it in. Don't talk about the rate of a single consultant because they didn't hire a single consultant. They hired quite a lot of them. In fact, they had a contract with a single consultancy firm for which they were paying over £100,000 a day. Again, for consultancy services for track and trace system that has got worse, not better. And of course, that money, if it was spent in Greater Manchester, would be more than they're actually asking for. We wouldn't even have to spend that much. In fact, that's double the amount Greater Manchester are asking for, and it would be better spent there. But anyway, Starmer then went on to say he thought that Johnson had crossed a Rubicon here. Not just with the miserly way he's treating Greater Manchester, but the gubbit, take it or leave it way that these local deals are being done. He said it's corrosive to public trust to pit region against region, mayor against mayor. Although, to be honest, I think he's making a big mistake in this, Johnson. If he thinks he's pitting region against region, I have to say, I think in the north of England, when you look at what people are saying around the regions, I think he's not turning. He's trying to turn regions against region, like trying to turn like Merseyside against Greater Manchester. Those two areas are not really, pro-Conservative anyway. But for some areas that have become pro-Conservative since, after the election, I think he's turning them back against the Tories rather than against each other. But anyway, Starmer then said we need a one nation approach, replace local battles with clear national criteria and support for jobs. Obviously, Johnson's never going to do that because if there were clear national criteria, he wouldn't be able to favourably treat Conservative areas, would he, or his own constituencies. Then Starmer brought up the motion that Labour brought up yesterday to carry on free school meals for kids in severe poverty over Christmas, just like happened over summer. Of course, the Conservatives voted that down. Someone else had to point out the stupidity here. Marcus Rashford, footballer who spearheaded the campaign to have them fed over summer and forced a U-turn over the government over that, was given an MBE 2 weeks ago for doing just that. Marcus Rashford was given an MBE 2 weeks ago by the government for foiling the government over starving kids. And then they have just voted to do the same thing this Christmas. Absolutely obscene. But anyway, Prime Minister just stood up, banged on about the figures again. Again, he wasn't directly asked a question as such, other than why aren't you supporting this measure? Again, whenever he's asked why aren't you supporting this measure, he always says, well, I'm supporting my own measures and my own measures are just as good. It's all worthless. Those kids are still going to be starving this Christmas. And again, all of his talk of figures are worthless. Say what's needed when you're talking about the figures put in, because then we can see for ourselves. Otherwise, what are you talking about? More ranting, more ranting. So then Starmer for his sixth one. It's actually a bit of a shame this. I'd have liked to have seen this come a bit earlier, and I'll go through why in a moment. So Starmer for his sixth question said, look, in his press conference the day before, the Prime Minister produced heat maps across the country showing the infection rates going up across all ages and across all regions. He said it showed regions that have been in the equivalent of Tier 2 restrictions for weeks, if not months, going into Tier 3. Now, if they're moving into Tier 3, then Tier 2 hasn't worked. Because if Tier 2 had worked, they should be going into Tier 1. Because the point is, although this new tier system is new, what is Tier 2 has actually existed by different names for months already. So that's been tried out and it's failed. Because the areas that were in those restrictions are now moving up, not down. So then Starmer said, so Tier 2 goes into Tier 3. Tier 3 has no end. Because there's no prospect or confidence in the R rate coming below 1. And he said Cornwall, possibly the Isle of Wight, are the only places where the infection rate today is less than Greater Manchester was when it went into local restrictions. In other words, every single part of England, apart from Cornwall, because Isle of Wight, of course, is not part of England, every single part of England apart from Cornwall is now in a worse state than Greater Manchester was when the government intervened there. So he said there's a stark choice. We can face weeks and months of prolonged agony for millions of people in Tier 2 and Tier 3 with no exit, or we put in place a 2 to 3 week time-limited circuit break to bring the virus back under control. He said Wales, Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland have chosen to do this. That might be an important statement later, because if in another month or so we can see, when there has been time to see cause and effect, we can see especially stark differences in progress between regions in England and the other UK nations, this will be coming back. Starmer said the Prime Minister was too slow to act in the first phase of this pandemic. He's being too slow again. We cannot repeat the same mistake. Will he act in the public interest and put a circuit break in this Friday? Now, here's Johnson, obviously, sixth question, he knows there's no comeback, went on his showboating, but there's a couple of things of relevance that he said. First of all, he said that Starmer's suggestion wouldn't work because it would involve closing schools. No, it wouldn't. Starmer's suggestion is to do what the scientists have argued for. The scientists have not argued for closing schools. He also said that Starmer couldn't say how long it would last. He literally just said it would be 2 to 3 weeks. Whereas it's actually Johnson who can't say how long his will last. Maybe Starmer... And again, this is why I would have asked this question earlier, for two reasons. First of all, if he'd have asked it earlier, whatever Johnson said, Starmer could have come back at him. So if Starmer had tried saying it involves closing schools and you're not saying how long it is, I'd be able to stand up and go, it doesn't involve closing schools. You know, you're misleading Parliament there inadvertently. Maybe you'd like to take that back. Second, and you should know what I'm proposing, because all I'm proposing is you follow your own scientific advisors. You've got their advice written down in case you've forgotten it. Secondly, we do know how long it will last, 2 to 3 weeks. And then he could have asked his own question at the end. He said, how long will yours last? I'm telling you that my proposal lasts for a maximum of 3 weeks. How long does your proposal last for? But of course he didn't. He asked it as his sixth question. If there was a mistake yesterday, that was it. Then the SNP, Ian Blackford. Now I have to say, he was asking his questions remotely again, as he sometimes does, but this time it was only with audio. There was no video there. Now I do hope, I have criticised in the past his setup at home. Because, they're like, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to be mean. He didn't have to throw in the webcam off. I'm sorry, Ian. I'm sorry. But anyway, he was questioning the furlough scheme again. He said, and he brought in as an aside, that, if the Prime Minister is complaining that he can't get by on £150,000 a year salary, if he finds it such a struggle, how does he expect workers to get by on £5.84 an hour when the Tory furlough cuts sink in? To which Johnson, same as always, I mean, this question's been asked ad infinitum. Johnson will just keep coming up with the stock answers, which is that workers are still going to be they're not actually getting any cuts. We're just doing a different system that's going to work out at the same for them. But this is demonstrably not true. And so then Blackford's second one, he linked Johnson with Thatcher, saying, look, just like Thatcher in the 80s, he's just sat by being fine with the rise in unemployment. He said there's 1 week left of this furlough scheme. Will the Prime Minister U-turn and stop these cuts? And again, Prime Minister, in many ways a pointless question. Prime Minister just denied that he wasn't supporting people. We've seen it before, nothing new here really. So in terms of the Prime Minister's questions there, the real take home, of course, was two things of interest. First of all, this lie that Johnson told about Sadiq Khan bankrupting Transport for London is going to come back to bite him, because that's demonstrably untrue. The deficit he is running is way less than Johnson. I mean, that's a silly lie for Johnson to have told, because he himself was Mayor of London when he ran a much higher deficit. And also, the fact he has no exit. And that's going to be particularly telling. I'm going to be very interested in the polls over the next couple of weeks, because Starmer has just basically represented the nation. The nation are now in these restrictions. They're saying to Johnson, how do we get out of them? When do they end? Johnson is not able to say. That is the take home there. But anyway, those are my thoughts on PMQs. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.